I'm Paige. Welcome back to my kitchen. You're watching the next episode of Doughin' It with Paigey. Can you believe it? It's finally here. We are doing the final recipe in the cookbook, Bread Baking for Beginners by Bonnie Ohara, and that is the Alchemy Sourdough Recipe. If you've been working your way through the book up until this point, congratulations, you have made it so far. By this point, you should have a pretty firm grasp on bread making techniques, and you should feel pretty confident about tackling this recipe. Now, if you're new to this channel or you're just starting out, I don't think that this is a great place to start unless you're feeling super confident about tackling a pretty complicated sourdough recipe. But if you're new and you're just starting out, I'll direct you to the very first recipe in this book. I have a video on it and I'll leave that right up here for you. Now, I've tried this recipe out several times for you guys, and this is definitely a bread that requires some planning. It technically takes about 3 days of prep time before you can actually bake this bread. If you're struggling with your planning or your time management for this recipe, that is totally understandable. This is a very complex recipe, and like I said, it does require planning. For that reason, I did leave a rough schedule in the description for you guys, just so you can kind of see what I do to map out my day, and it'll have each step with a time next to it, and you can adjust and modify that as needed if you're trying this at home. With all that being said, I'm really excited to go ahead and get started on this recipe with you guys. I am going to show you what I did yesterday and last night to prep for this recipe. For starters, you're going to need a mature and active sourdough starter. If you need to know how to make one of those, it takes about a week, and I have a video on that as well. I'll leave it right up here. Now, referring to step 1 in your cookbook, you're going to need to feed your sourdough starter 12 hours before you perform step 1. You're going to want to make sure that your starter is at peak activity when you perform step 1. Peak activity happens about 12 hours after you feed it. A good way to find out if your starter is at peak activity is to feed it, allow it to rest for 12 hours. After that 12-hour mark, it will have doubled in size and it will be really light, airy, bubbly, and fluffy. That is the best time to use your sourdough starter. Another way to test your sourdough starter to see if it's ready to be used is to drop a little piece of sourdough starter into a glass of warm water. If it floats, that means it's ready to go. So I fed my sourdough starter yesterday morning, and last night I performed step 1. I like to prepare this mixture in a large bowl. I'll start by adding in my sourdough starter, again, that is at peak activity, my water, that is the correct temperature based on page 21 in the book, my whole wheat flour, and my rye flour. Once all of these are combined in a large bowl, I'm using a rubber spatula to just mix all of this together. Once that's all mixed up, I'm going to cover this up loosely with a lid, and I will check on this in 12 hours. Now, here's an insider tip that is not mentioned in the book. After you complete step 1 and you're getting ready to let that mixture rest for 12 hours, go ahead and feed your sourdough starter again. You're going to need that starter back at peak activity when you prepare your second build in the morning. 12 hours after preparing this, I'm going to remove the lid, and as you can see here, I've got a lot of small bubbles inside of this mixture. It's been fermenting overnight and it should have a sour smell to it. Now it's time to prepare your second build. Now, the second build was something that was really hard for me to grasp and understand when I first started this recipe, but essentially it is just a meal for your starter. Directly on top of that mixture you prepared last night, you're going to add in more starter, which is at peak activity, whole wheat flour, rye flour, and water. I'm going to use a rubber spatula again to mix all of this up until it is well combined, and we're going to let it ferment for an additional 4 hours. After that 4-hour mark, I have a lot of little bubbles throughout the starter mixture, as well as some larger air bubbles under the surface. This is looking really good, so I'm going to go ahead and start mixing my dough. I'm going to start off by weighing out all the ingredients I need for my bread. In separate bowls, I'll start off by weighing out my water, salt, whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour, and bread flour. Do as I say and not as I do. Don't combine all of your flours in one large bowl. It's a lot easier to measure those out if they're in separate bowls and then just combine them later. I hate to sound like a broken record here, but do make sure that your water temperature is correct based on the temperature calculations on page 21. On top of this starter mixture in the large bowl, I'm going to add my water directly on top of this, and I like to use a whisk to give this a good stir, whisk all around the bowl, make sure that I'm scraping all of the starter up from the bottom of the bowl and combining it well with the water. After this is well mixed, it should be very bubbly and frothy, so I'm going to go ahead and add the flours and the salt directly on top of this mixture. Now we'll jump right in and we'll start mixing this all up by hand, and you will notice right off the bat this dough is a lot more hydrated than any other recipe in this book. It's very sticky. Don't be intimidated by that. Just continue to work with it. It will start to stiffen up a little bit as you continue to mix. As always, make sure you're squeezing your dough. You're scraping all of the dry ingredients up from the bottom of the bowl and off the sides of the bowl, and just make sure you're squeezing, folding, stretching. Make sure you're doing everything you can to get your wet ingredients mixed with the dry ingredients. As always, it is a very good indicator when your dough is well mixed if you can pull on your dough and get a nice good stretch out of it. If you're pulling it up and it's breaking off very easily, it needs to be mixed more. Now, this is a step in the book that is omitted, although I never skip this step. It's allowing your dough to rest. I'm going to allow 30 minutes for my dough to rest so that the flour can absorb some of that water. I'll come back and check in with you guys in 30 minutes. All right, it's been about 30 minutes. Our dough is done resting. It's time to go ahead and give it the first set of folds. Before we get started, I want to talk about the folding process and the rising process. After we start this first set of folds, our dough is going to rise for 5 hours total, just like it did in the intermediate sourdough recipe. We are going to be giving our dough a set of folds every 20 minutes for the first 2 hours of that rise. I like to map this out on a piece of paper just so I can have my 20-minute increments just set in stone, and I also like to have a timer ready just so I can be alerted every time those 20-minute increments come up. With wet hands, you'll see that I'm just stretching and folding the dough to meet the other side. My wet hands prevent the dough from really sticking to them, so I always use wet hands when I perform these stretch and folds. It's a lot easier to manage my dough that way. And I'll go all around the dough doing this until it has tightened up. Once it's tightened up, I'm going to set that timer for 20 minutes. I'm going to make my chart for all of my 20-minute increments for the next couple of hours, and then we will move on to a 3-hour uninterrupted rise. I'll show you guys what these sets of folds look like, but I'll do it in a time lapse so I don't bore you guys to death. Finally, after 2 hours and 7 sets of folds, we are finished. We are now moving on to a 3-hour uninterrupted rise. This is my window to get some stuff done around the house today. I'm gonna let my dough rest and hang out for about 3 hours. I'll come back and check in with you guys then. All right, our dough has been rising for about 3 hours uninterrupted. I was able to get some stuff done around the house like I said I was, and it's finally done. It really filled up the bowl. It's doubled in size. It is ready to be pre-shaped. So we're gonna start off by lightly flouring our countertops and turning our dough out of the bowl. To pre-shape our dough, we are just going to divide this into 2 equal pieces. I made the full recipe today, so this makes 2 loaves. We're going to give each piece of dough a couple of sets of letter folds. So you're gonna start from the farthest side from you and fold this down to meet the middle. Start from the side closest to you and fold that up to meet the middle. And then you'll do the same thing from the right and from the left. If your dough is very relaxed, you can give it another set of letter folds to help tighten it up a little bit. Now you'll do the exact same method with the other piece of dough. Now that our dough is pre-shaped, we're gonna let them bench rest on the counter just like this with the seam side up for about 30 minutes so that they can relax just a little bit. Then we'll come back and get them shaped. All right, it's been about 30 minutes. Our dough is done bench resting. We're gonna flip these over and get them shaped. We're gonna do that same method with the letter folds. So start from the farthest side from you and fold this down to meet the center. Same from the closest side to you. From the right or the left. And then from the other side. Just make sure to seal the seam pretty tightly. Now I'm gonna add a little bit more flour to my countertop and I'm gonna flip this back over. I'm just gonna use a cupping motion, cupping my hands under the dough and turning it on the countertop. This will create even tension across the top of the loaf. And if you're more comfortable with your dough scraper, you can also use that to slide from all sides. All right, so I'm gonna flour the top of my loaf here pretty well. When these are done being shaped, I've got a couple of well-floured proofing baskets. I'm gonna pop these in seam side up. Now I'm gonna do the exact same thing with the other loaf. You'll notice I'm not adding any flour to this when I flip this over because if you add flour to the sticky side of your dough, it's not going to allow the dough to stick to itself when you create these folds. Now when you're creating this tension across the top of your loaf, you want to do this without tearing the dough. So it's important to be careful and to not get this too tight. Same thing with this loaf. I'm just gonna add a little bit of flour to the top of it and it'll go seam side up into the proofing basket. I'm gonna cover our proofing baskets and our dough up with a couple of floured kitchen towels and we're gonna let our dough proof for about an hour to an hour and a half. All right, it's been about an hour and a half. Our dough is just about done proofing. The way you can tell is if you poke a finger into your dough and it leaves an indent, that means it is done. If you poke it and it springs right back up, it needs a little bit more time. But these are looking good. Just like we did with the intermediate sourdough video, I'm going to be popping these into the refrigerator overnight and I'll be baking them tomorrow. Now, if you're baking this spread at home and your dough is done proofing, you can go ahead and preheat your oven and slash your bread and get it in there and enjoy it. As for me, I'm looking for a detailed score and I'm also not looking to bake bread at about 9 o'clock at night. So I'm gonna pop it in the fridge and enjoy it tomorrow. So I'll come back and check in with you guys then. Hey, and I'm back. Our dough has been proofing in the refrigerator overnight. I'm baking a little bit later than I would have liked to, but I had a few things to get done this morning. I've got my oven preheating and my Dutch ovens preheating. Once my oven is fully preheated, I'm gonna go ahead and take my dough out of the fridge and get it scored and pop it directly into the oven. For those wondering if you have to thaw out your loaves after they've been in the refrigerator, I never do. I usually just score them immediately and pop them right in. My goal for these loaves today is to get one that has a good ear on it, and I'm hoping with the other one, I can have a really intricate design for you guys. Wish me luck, we're about to get started. I'm going to start by turning my dough out of the proofing basket onto some parchment paper, very carefully removing the basket so the liner does not tear the dough. I'm going to do a really simple score on this loaf, just a straight line down the center. Try to keep your lamb at a 10-degree angle when scoring if you want to get a good ear on it. I always seem to forget that about halfway through the score. For the other loaf, I'll start off by adding a little bit of flour to the loaf. It helps show your designs a little bit better. I'm just using a razor to make a cross in the center of the loaf, and I'm slashing this pretty deeply here. And around the rest of the loaf, I'm going to very lightly use my blade to make some wheat-shaped designs. You'll see that I have my parchment paper cut out a little bit differently today. I have a couple of little handles on the side, so it's easier for me to drop them into the Dutch oven. Once these are scored, I'm going to drop them right into the hot Dutch oven, cover them back up. We're going to bake them for about 20 minutes with the lid on. After that, I'll remove the lid and bake them for an additional 25 minutes. Here is what my loaves look like after 20 minutes in the oven with the lid on. I'm removing the lid and popping them back into the oven for 25 minutes, and here is the final result. My bread's been cooling on a wire rack for about 30 minutes, actually a little bit under 30 minutes, but I am so eager to cut into it. It smells so good in here. I've been baking this bread for what seems like a week, so I am ready to cut into it. Let's go ahead and do a taste test. So the bread turned out so good. The only thing is I am a little upset it doesn't have more of an open crumb or a lot larger holes in it. I'm kind of upset about that, but you can't have a perfect loaf every single time. The flavor of the bread is so good. It's sour, it's slightly sweet. This is just an all-around really good multi-grain loaf of bread. I do find when I put my dough in the refrigerator and let that sit overnight, I have a way better spring in the oven. You can see here my loaves just kind of rise a lot more than they do if they're at room temperature. It also seems to make the bread very moist inside, which who doesn't love that? I'll be the first to admit there has been a little bit delay on filming and publishing this video, but I've just been so sad to bring this portion of my series to a close. Working my way through this book has opened so many opportunities for me, and I started my channel because of this book, and I am just so happy I was able to help any of you. If I was able to help one person, that just makes my day. But I really do want to know what you guys want to see from me next. Of course, I can always cook through another cookbook. There is a cookbook I've had my eye on. It's New World Sourdough by Brian Ford. Of course, it's all fermented bread, which a lot of you may like, and it might be a little bit more advanced. I've also heard that Bonnie Ohara is coming out with a second cookbook, and I think it's supposed to be published next year. So I'd also like your feedback on that. Let me know if you'd like to see me cooking my way through her second book. Obviously, I can keep my channel dough themed if you guys would like me to stay on the bread train, but I can also move into other types of dough like pasta. So let me know if that's something that you guys would like to see. I guess what I'm getting to is this is not the end of my series. This is not the end of my channel. We're just at the end of this cookbook. Thank you so much for following along. I have truly enjoyed this journey so much. I can't even express to you how happy this has made me this year. 2020 has been a weird year. If you're watching this in the future, just maybe look up the news on 2020. It's been terrible. But I've had the best year and the best following, the best followers, the best feedback from this, and I just couldn't have asked for anything more. As always, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. Thanks again for watching Doughing It with Paigey. I'll see you guys next time.
Nailed it.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. It technically takes about 3 days of prep time before you can actually bake this bread.
3 days.
I had a whole script going. We're veteran YouTubers.
We are.
With our whiteboard. I know, it's crazy. Where's my beer? Okay, I think we're done.